The wind keened across the ridges like the cry of something wounded slipping down through the black pines until it reached the lonely cabin clinging to the slope. Inside, Clara lay beneath a patchwork quilt worn thin by too many winters. Her breath came shallow and uneven, each inhale tugging against the swell of her belly beneath the faded cotton of her dress. She was heavy with child, yet felt lighter than smoke, as though one strong gust might scatter her altogether. Outside, the storm pressed its cold fingers through the chinks in the wall, rattling the shutters with merciless rhythm. The sound filled the room, a reminder of how small she had become, how forgotten. Each gust seemed to whisper that no one was coming, that she had been cast off like driftwood. She pulled the quilt tighter, but it did nothing to muffle the howl of the mountain night. Her mind wandered back to softer days, to the moment she once believed she would walk proudly into a church, her arm linked with a man who had sworn devotion. But that dream had vanished when her condition began to show. His letters stopped. His name curdled into a curse whispered on the lips of neighbors. In the town's judgmental eyes, she was no longer worthy of grace. The sheriff himself had told her flat and cold, a woman makes her choices, and she must live with them. So she climbed the ridges, carrying shame and child together, until she found this forgotten shelter. Now hunger gnawed at her ribs. The corner cupboard offered only a handful of cornmeal and a nearly empty jar of beans. She pressed a trembling palm against her belly, whispering soundless words as though her unborn child could be comforted. Life stirred faintly inside her, fragile yet stubborn, even as winter closed its grip. The storm clawed harder at the cabin walls when suddenly the door groaned open with a force that froze Clara where she lay. Snow whirled in on the wind, and through the swirl stepped a figure broad enough to block the firelight. For a moment she thought it was the storm itself taking shape, shoulders like a cliff face. A coat of heavy buffalo, hide a beard rhymed with frost. His presence filled the doorway, in a silence heavier than the wind outside. Her fingers fumbled for the iron poker by the hearth. Wolves sometimes prowled these ridges, but no wolf ever carried the weight of boots that deliberate. The man Thomas, though she did not yet know his name, stood motionless. His eyes, gray as river stones, swept the room, caught on her frail form beneath the quilt, then settled with a steadiness that neither threatened nor yielded. Clara's voice came out ragged, trembling, as much from weakness as fear. "What do you want?" The question hung brittle in the storm-filled silence. Thomas gave no reply. Instead, with unhurried calm, he reached into the satchel slung across his chest. From it he pulled a wrapped bundle, rough cloth tied with leather cord. He stepped just far enough into the room to place it on the small table near the door. Then without a word he turned back the snow, swallowing him once more. The door banged shut behind him, leaving only the echo of his heavy tread. For long minutes Clara could not move. The poker slipped from her hand and struck the floor with a metallic clatter. Her breath came fast, sharp, as though she had seen a ghost. The bundle sat there in the dim light, a shape both ordinary and impossible. When at last she staggered to it, her hands tore clumsily at the knots. Inside she found strips of jerked venison, coarse bread hardened for travel, and a small tin of coffee. Food enough for days. Her knees buckled. She sank onto the stool, pressing her face into her hands. The sobs came raw, unbidden, spilling from a heart she had kept armored for too long. Gratitude seared through her, fierce as shame. She had not asked yet, here was provision. She had wanted to stand unbent before the world, and instead she was fed by a stranger's mercy. Every bite she took would taste of dead. Still as the fire hissed and spat, she knew she would eat, because beyond pride lay survival. And in the hollow where despair had lived, something else flickered, a recognition that someone unseen until now had marked her struggle and chosen not to turn away. When morning came, Clara braved the snow to fetch water from the creek. Her legs trembled under the strain, the bucket nearly slipping from her grip. A chill ran deeper than the cold when she looked up and saw him again, half hidden among the pines. She remembered his name now, a faint whisper from town, Gossip Thomas McGraw. Once a soldier, now a man who had chosen the mountains over mankind. Whispers said he carried blood on his hands, scars carved by war that no preacher's words could smooth. Thomas did not approach. His gaze was steady, unreadable, as if he belonged more to the ridge than to any hearth. Clara clutched the bucket to her chest and hurried back inside, her pulse hammering. That night the wind shrieked through the shutters, and when she opened the door the next morning, another bundle waited. split logs, dry kindling, and a strip of salt pork wrapped in cloth. Later still came a jar of honey, its golden light catching fire in the dim cabin, then a coil of rope, a fur pelt to soften her bed. No footsteps betrayed his visits. No voice announced his presence. Only these small mercies left with the patience of someone who expected nothing in return. Clara's pride rebelled. She had fled town to prove she could endure, to escape the judgment that branded her weak and fallen. To accept these offerings felt like surrender. And yet hunger did not care for dignity. Cold demanded wood. The child within her demanded more than resolve. Each night as she wept into the quilt, she told herself she would repay it all someday. Yet beneath that defiance stirred another truth in this wilderness, unseen by the world. Someone had quietly chosen her survival. The weak sun pierced through the clouds, and Clara stepped outside with a bucket in hand, determined to gather snow for melting. But her strength betrayed her. The world tilted, her knees buckled, and she steadied herself against the rough logs of the cabin wall. Breathless and dizzy, she clutched her belly, fear crawling up her spine. When she lifted her eyes, he was there, Thomas striding from the tree line with an armful of wood. For a heartbeat, she thought he might turn away, but he stopped just short of her. His gray eyes swept over her frail form, lingering without judgment, only recognition. She opened her lips to protest, to tell him to leave her be, but no words came. Instead, Thomas knelt and set the logs neatly by the door. Then, without pause, he crouched lower, drew an axe from his belt, and began to split the wood. Each stroke landed with steady precision, his muscles straining against worn leather. The rhythm was almost prayerful, older than words, filling the clearing with the sound of survival. Clara stood silent, her breath misting in the cold air, watching strength offered without a single demand. And when the task was done, he rose, nodded once, and disappeared into the trees. The storm had deepened by nightfall snow, falling in suffocating sheets that erased the world beyond the window. Clara, desperate to fetch water from the barrel outside, pulled her shawl tighter and stepped into the blizzard. The cold bit instantly into her lungs, slicing her breath short. She slipped on the ice, the bucket clattering from her grasp as pain lanced through her belly. Her cry was swallowed by the wind. Darkness crowded her vision. Then boots crunching fast on frozen ground. Strong arms scooped her up as though she weighed nothing. The scent of leather and pine surrounded her, the steady rhythm of a man's stride grounding her panic. Thomas carried her through the storm, the door bursting open as firelight spilled across the cabin floor. He lowered her gently onto the quilt, his movements clumsy yet careful, as though he feared she might break under his touch. Without a word, he stoked the fire, coaxing flames to life until warmth pushed back against the cold, suffocating grip. His broad shadow moved across the walls, rough hands placing wood with surprising care. Clara trembled, teeth chattering, unable to muster more than a whisper. He pressed a tin cup to her lips, broth hot and fragrant. She swallowed shakily, the heat sliding down into the hollow ache of her body. Her eyes lifted. Thomas stood close, his gray gaze steady, unflinching. It was not judgment she found there, nor the scorn of neighbors who had turned their backs, but something altogether different: shelter. Reverence, as though her frailty was not something to despise, but to guard. For the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to lean, not fully, not recklessly, but just enough to feel that she was not utterly alone. The storm outside screamed like a wounded beast, rattling the shutters and clawing at the roof. But within those rough-hewn walls, a fragile silence bloomed. Thomas did not speak. He did not need to. His presence, solid and unshaken, was answer enough to every doubt that had haunted her since exile. Clara clutched the quilt tighter, the taste of broth still warm in her mouth. And when she dared to meet his eyes again, she felt it clear as breath. This was not pity. It was promise. The fire roared high, casting shifting gold across the cabin walls, but Clara's body trembled with a storm of its own. A sharp pang tore through her belly, so sudden and fierce it stole the breath from her lungs. She clutched at the quilt, eyes wide, panic rising, as the reality of her child's coming pressed hard and merciless. Through the haze, she felt rather than saw Thomas draw closer. His great frame bent low, his shadow sheltering hers as the blizzard battered against the shutters. His rough hands hovered uncertain, afraid of causing harm, yet his presence was a weight that steadied rather than smothered. Then for the first time his voice broke the silence. 2 words gravel deep yet softened by something she could not name. Hold on. Simple, unadorned, the words carried more than comfort. They were anchor and promise, a rope flung across the gulf of her fear. Clara's tears welled as the storm shrieked outside, but within those 2 syllables she heard everything the world had denied her: protection, companionship, a vow not spoken in ceremony, but in necessity. And as the pain surged again, she clung not only to breath, but to those words. Morning broke gently, not with judgmental eyes or harsh words from the town, but with the steady rhythm of life inside the cabin. Clara woke to the scent of wood smoke and broth, her body still frail, yet her spirit steadied by the quiet constancy around her. Each day Thomas moved about with silent purpose. She would watch from her place on the quilt as he patched the sagging roof, his broad shoulders bent beneath the weight of timber, or split logs with one sure stroke, stacking them neatly by the hearth. Even in the smallest tasks, tending fire, mending a hinge, there was a reverence in his movements, as though labor itself was a form of prayer. He never demanded recognition. He never asked for thanks. Yet his presence filled the cabin more firmly than the warmth of the blaze. Clara felt her pride resist, at first whispering that she owed him repayment, that charity chained her to shame. But as the days lengthened, she began to see something else. His work was not charity, but choice. Every nail hammered, every bucket filled, was less about her weakness and more about his quiet vow to keep her alive. One evening, as lavender dusk spilled across the snowfields, Clara noticed Thomas sitting by the fire, knife in hand. His scarred fingers moved carefully, shaving curls of pine from a small block of wood. She tilted her head, curious, watching the concentration on his face. At last he held out the figure, a horse rough but unmistakable, its form simple, yet shaped with patience. For the child, he muttered, voice gruff, as though embarrassed by the softness of the act. Clara's breath caught. Her fingers brushed his as she took the little carving, and for the first time in months her tears came not from fear, but from a warmth blooming in her chest. This was not pity. It was preparation, hope carved into something tangible. She traced the wooden figure's shape and realized that the silence between them had grown less heavy, more like shelter than exile. In that moment she understood survival had shifted into something gentler, something that felt dangerously close to belonging. The day came when Clara could no longer avoid it. Flour cloth and salt had run low, and the little cabin, safe as it was, could not supply everything. With the child pressing heavier against her spine, she dreaded the walk down into town. Memories of turned backs and whispered condemnation clung to her like shadows. Yet when Thomas harnessed the mule and silently took the reins, she felt the faintest shield forming between her and the storm she knew awaited. The bell above the store door jangled as they entered, and at once the air shifted. A hush spread through the room like ripples across still water. Clara felt every gaze sharp as pins against her skin. Lydia Pike's voice sliced through the silence. Back again, carrying your sins in plain sight. Snickers followed, thin and cruel, hidden behind bonnets and false smiles. Clara lowered her eyes, cheeks burning. Shame coiled, but before it crushed her completely, Thomas stepped forward. He did not speak, nor did he rebuke. Instead, his tall frame cast a shadow that stretched across the floorboards, his steady presence pressing against the mockery like a wall of stone. His gray gaze swept the room, meeting eyes one by one, until the laughter died in the throats that birthed it. In that stillness, Clara's heart beat differently, not from humiliation, but from a quiet, defiant strength. For the first time, she left the store not flayed by gossip, but walking beside someone whose silence was stronger than their scorn. The snow crunched beneath their boots as Clara and Thomas made the long walk back from town. Clara clutched the small parcel of flour to her chest, but it felt heavier than stone. Each whisper, each sideways glance from the store still rang in her ears. By the time they reached the quiet shelter of the cabin, the weight inside her heart was unbearable. She set the bundle down on the table, her hands trembling, and spoke in a voice frayed with despair. "They will never forgive me," she whispered, staring at the fire's glow. "The town, the women, the men, they've decided who I am. And maybe they're right." Her voice cracked, and for a moment it sounded as though the storm outside had found its way into her chest. Thomas remained by the doorway, shoulders squared, gaze steady. He didn't rush to her side, didn't try to wrap her pain in false comfort. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, like stones shifting deep under the earth. People talk because they fear their own emptiness, he said. Their words are nothing but echoes of what they cannot face in themselves. His gray eyes caught the firelight, glinting softer than she had ever seen. You don't owe them your life, Clara. Not one breath of it. The room fell quiet again, but this silence carried no shame. It was a silence of truth, solid, immovable, where for the first time Clara felt less condemned and more free. The storm outside slammed against the cabin like 1,000 fists, the wind shrieking through every crack in the wood. Snow hammered the roof and rattled the shutters, but inside a storm of another kind tore through Clara's body. A wrenching pain gripped her belly, sharp and merciless. Her cry split the room, raw and trembling. She clutched at the quilt, sweat breaking across her brow despite the icy air. Thomas was on his feet instantly, though panic flickered in his eyes. He was a man who had faced war wolves and the unforgiving mountain, but this was different. Tell me what to do, he muttered, his rough hands hovering, uncertain but willing. Clara could barely breathe through the contractions, yet she forced out fragments of the midwife's lessons she'd once overheard. Boil water. Tear cloth. Keep the fire strong. He moved clumsily but fast, pouring water into a kettle, ripping strips from old linen feeding logs to the fire until flames leapt high against the stone hearth. His large frame cast shadows across the walls, but his movements, though trembling, carried a strange reverence, as though each act mattered more than his own life. Wave after wave of pain racked Clara, bending her body to breaking. She screamed, her voice drowned by thunder overhead. Through it all, Thomas knelt beside her, his voice a steady rumble against the chaos. Hold on. Hold on. He repeated the words again and again, as if they were a rope he could throw across the chasm of agony, binding her to survival. His calloused hand pressed a cool cloth to her brow, the gesture gentle grounding. Hours blurred into firelight and thunder. Clara's body trembled, but she bore down one final time, a cry ripping from her throat. And then silence. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Thomas lifted the tiny form into his hands, his chest heaving. Clara's heart nearly stopped. No, she whispered. But then a thin cry pierced the storm, fragile yet fierce, alive against the roar of wind. Thomas's face broke the stone of his features, cracking into awe. He wrapped the newborn in a cloth and placed her in Clara's trembling arms. Tears streamed down Clara's cheeks as she pressed her lips to the baby's damp forehead. Alive, she gasped, voice breaking with wonder. We are alive. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, three hearts beat together, defying death's shame and the winter itself. Thomas had spent years building walls higher than the ridges around him. War had carved silence into his bones, solitude into his skin. Yet as he stood inside that small cabin watching Clara cradle their newborn child, he felt something stir that he hadn't dared imagine belonging. What had once been a hollow shelter of wood and stone now carried the rhythm of three steady heartbeats. In their fragile breaths and trembling smiles, he discovered a family where he thought only exile remained. Days after the storm broke, the mountain wore a clean face of snow and light. Abigail No, Clara now standing taller than before, walked slowly in the meadow, her child swaddled close. Thomas steady at her side. He carried no flag of triumph, no proclamation of guardianship, only the quiet strength of presence. And the town noticed. When they ventured down for supplies, the same eyes that once cut her with whispers now faltered beneath the sight of Thomas walking beside her. His silence was its own shield, a shadow that blunted gossip, a weight that made cruel tongues stumble. Clara no longer bowed her head. She looked forward, shoulders straight, the child in her arms, no longer a mark of disgrace but of survival. There was dignity in her step now, dignity born not from the town's approval, but from the quiet alliance they had built in the mountains. People could still mutter, still judge, but the sight of her beside Thomas shifted something subtle yet undeniable. She was not alone, and in that fact alone, shame lost its bite. Evenings on the porch became their ritual. Clara would rock gently with the child, the fading sun washing her face in gold. Tomas stood near, his profile cast against the horizon, a man shaped by scars yet softened by the presence of life renewed. The sky would bleed fire and lavender, and in those moments words seemed unnecessary. Yet sometimes Thomas's voice, deep and low, would break the stillness. Sometimes the ashes hold more life than the flame, he murmured one evening, eyes fixed on the horizon. Clara turned startled by the poetry in a man who so rarely spoke. She saw then that he wasn't only talking about himself or her, but about both of them, about what had been burned away and what stubbornly endured. She nodded, tears stinging her eyes because she knew he was right. They had both been reduced to ashes by betrayal, shame, and loss. But out of that ruin, something steady, quiet, and fiercely alive had taken root. Nights grew gentler. The baby's soft cries broke the silence, and Thomas's rough, scarred hand was often the one to cradle her, his massive frame bending into tenderness no one would have believed. Clara would watch him by lamplight, awe pressing in her chest, because here was a man who had given without asking, protected without demanding, and loved without declaration. And so, without vows shouted in a church or promises carved in stone, three people moved forward into tomorrow. Not with grandeur, but with the weight of something sturdier, a love that had survived storms, a trust born of silence, and a promise breathed into every small act. Clara Thomas and their child stood against the world not with defiance, but with a quiet endurance that needed no explanation. It was enough.